All right, this is week 8, lecture 3, and I'm going to talk to you specifically about a specific missional posture within our world. This one's near and dear to my heart, and so I don't know how long this particular lecture is going to be. I'll try to keep it shorter. I know you've got a lot you're working on, so I don't want to keep you busy too long, but. So when I came to faith, I was 25 years old, and I was a member of the United States Army. And I was a part of the military-industrial complex. I was a soldier. I was a sergeant. It shaped my identity. Then I came to Christ, and I began to read this story about this Jesus person. And I began to realize that this Jesus person that I was reading about didn't seem to fit well my understanding of the world, especially when it came to violence. And then I began to read certain authors, Stanley Hauerwas, John Howard Yoder, Walter Wink, and these authors began to challenge some of my presuppositions regarding the way in which this world worked, especially in light of our propensity for violence. So if you're very familiar with the Old Testament, when the Israelites went into Babylon, that's about the time in which they really formulated their creation story, especially as it's articulated in Genesis chapter 1, or that's what many biblical scholars believe. And in that, they were speaking their creation story against another dominant myth called the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is a polytheistic creation story. But in their creation story, it's a creation story out of violence. So there's a battle between these gods, and out of the body of the gods, creation happens, and out of the blood of the god, humanity is made. And I want to encourage you, if you ever get a chance to look up the Enuma Elish, Apsu, Tiamat, Marduk. These are the names of the gods in those times. And I don't have time. I may actually share with you a little video clip that I've done in the past regarding that, and you can watch that one as well. But in that particular story, violence is primal. So it really gives a way of expressing why humanity is so violent. However, in the creation story, as we find it in the Jewish narrative, there is not multiple gods battling one another to form and shape creation. It is one God who makes all things out of nothing, and even with the introduction of chaos into the creation story, tovu bohu, which is the formless void chaos. There's this peaceful ordering of the chaos, and so even the ordering of chaos is peaceful. In the Apsu Tiamat narrative of the Enuma Elish, it's creation out of violence. In the Hebrew text, it is creation out of peace. And I believe that God has created us to be a peaceable people. That I think what we see when we see so many people suffer from the violence that they've done, whether you call it the post-traumatic stress disorder, or you see the lifelessness in the eyes of those who regularly perpetuate violence. I think that's because something happens to our souls, whether or not it's justified, whether you embrace a just war theory, whether you recognize that sometimes violence is necessary to subdue evil, regardless of your posture towards the necessity or the lack of necessity to violence. Violence itself is has a damaging effect upon the soul. And so I think what we see is we live in the midst of a culture where we have defined our narratives primarily by violence. I mean, especially within the Western context, especially within America, we often tell our stories by the wars that have been fought, whether it's the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Civil War. You can talk about the Spanish-American War. You can talk about World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Gulf War, and all the way into the War on Terror. We even use the language of war on drugs, war on poverty. We employ a language of warfare. And so we are naturally a fallen, violent people. We fell to violence. one of the things that I'm always intrigued by is that the fall doesn't stop at chapter 3 of Genesis, chapter 3 of Genesis, but moves to chapter 4. And in chapter 4 of Genesis, you see Cain slay Abel, which is the first act of fratricide, this brother killing brother. So when I say all that to say is that we live in a culture with this propensity towards violence, especially within the urban context. You see this all the time. I don't have to tell those of you who are in the city corridor of Chicago this, because you regularly witness this. And that propensity of violence tends to put us on edge and make us ready to strike back violently. And one of the challenges that we face as Christians is that there is an ethic within the kingdom that seems to suggest that we're not supposed to strike back with violence with the kind of regularity and the eagerness that we seem to as an American culture. That violence is something that should be foreign to the lives of the people of God. And so, in fact, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He doesn't say, "Blessed are the peace finders," as though peace is something that is easily discovered. But I think a missional theology takes seriously the call to make peace. And I think it's an embodiment of that peace in our lives. And that embodiment of our peace is in some respects a sort of an embrace of a nonviolent ethic. Our approach to people is not based upon the assumption of violence or even the response of violence, but more in line with that of sacrifice, of danger, of risk, of courage, of faithfully exploring the other, even if the other could be a violent other. That we are not primarily concerned about our safety and welfare, that we as followers of Christ, because we've conquered sin and death, not we, but Christ has conquered it, and we are participants in that conquering, that we do not go into those settings fearful of our finite reality, because we know that as more than conquerors, that we've already overcome death. So there's a willingness that we have. The early church, the first 300 years of the church prior to the Constantinian Christianization, was primarily nonviolent. They lacked military power and prowess. And in that, they had to embody the creativity, the risk, and the courage to stand in the face of violence, even if it meant violent responses to them. We often say that the church is planted out of the seed of the martyrs, right? It's this recognition that there are those that have gone to death for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And wherever martyrdom has happened, the church has exploded and taken off. Not that we seek martyrdom, and not that we are naive about a violent culture. And that, in fact, that's one of the most profound and powerful things that I think we need to be aware of, is we cannot be naive about violence. Violence is definitely a reality that we have to face, and one that we have to recognize is out there. But I do think there is at least room for a conversation regarding the necessity of rethinking our posture towards violence, and the call to be makers of peace, or to live within the shalom of God, which is not just an absence of conflict, but it's the willingness to embody the hospitality, generosity, graciousness, and peaceableness of God, even in the midst of hostility. And so I want to encourage you to begin to think through, within your context, what is the impact of being a peacemaker, and what kind of steps could you take to make peace within your culture, within your context. And so I want to challenge you to think through that, and to process and imagine the promise of being a peacemaker in your context.